And then we'll throw it open for discussion. The North-South roundtable was very much about the North and the South. And I reflect to Pearson and Brandt about how they were arguing that there was a mutual interest in development. But they argued it was very flimsy, the basis for this. There wasn't a justification. The North could really continue happily without the South. And I think that was a basic flaw in the reasoning of both commissions, which meant that their recommendations didn't take place. Today, we really are one world in a different sort of sense. It really does matter to the North what happens in the South, and conversely. And I'd like to mention two issues which I think are so intrinsically one world issues that one can't have effective policy without policy in both areas. And the first one is very well known, and it's climate change, and I won't say much about it. But literally the world can't survive unless action is taken in both North and in South. Ironically, and I looked up the data very quickly, Europe and North America account for half global emissions, and the rest of the world accounts for half global emissions. So clearly, you can't solve this problem without both areas, despite, of course, that Europe accounts for only 20% of the population and 60% of the income, and Europe and North America, and the others, of the population, 80%. But anyway, this is clearly a one-world problem. It's not a North-South problem. It's a one-world problem in a way that there was nothing in Pearson or Brandt which could compare with this. I want to talk about another connection which really relates to the work I'm doing, and which is a little bit less obvious, but to me is very obvious. And the work I'm doing is about how inequalities between groups, which we define as horizontal inequalities, can and often does cause conflict. And you see it very clearly in developing countries. I don't need to say too much about it. You can say Rwanda, or I can mention you many, or Côte d'Ivoire. You could go. It's very simple, straightforward. But what we see today is that there are inequalities within the North, and inequalities within the South, and inequalities between the North and the South, which play on each other, in my view, causing today's insecurities, so-called terrorism, or terrorism, we like to call it. And these inequalities are fundamentally Muslim West inequalities. And we always talk about those countries out there and how they need development, but we don't think about what's going on in our own country. And let me just talk about my own country, the UK, and I take from the Commission for Racial Equality, where Muslim populations are underrepresented in politics, in the police. Religious holidays are generally not recognised, certainly not in the same way as other people's holidays, particularly Christian holidays. They have schooling, they have worse housing, they have worse employment. The health of Pakistanis, among Pakistani population in the UK, twice as many report ill health as among the white British. This commission works out something called an employment penalty, meaning how much more difficult it is for people to get employment. And Pakistanis find that there's a 12% penalty among men and a 30% penalty among women. Well, I could go on. You find the same thing in France, and we saw it in France. You find the same thing between the Turkish and the German population. All right, we have these domestic inequalities, but we also have these international inequalities. And just take the example of Israel, Palestine, again, a Muslim populations, and incidentally within Israel. And you find that Palestine has incomes 1/12 those of per capita of Israel, and that there are similar health inequalities and unemployment 10-50 times as much. So we have inequalities globally between the West and between Arab countries. We have inequalities within countries, even within India, between Muslim populations and Hindus. We have inequalities within Britain. And people have a cultural unity, a cultural binding, which means that the people in Britain, them of course they're much richer, the Pakistanis are much richer than Arabs in Palestine, but they feel a sense of identity. And this sense of identity combined with a sense of injustice within the West and between the West seems to me behind a lot of our insecurities. And we're not going to deal with the insecurities and the terrorism and continual worries about all this unless we deal with both problems. So that's my second one world problem. It's a shared problem and not enough people realize it's a one world problem. Now, having said that, I just want to end reflecting on this view, which I think Barney put forward at the beginning, that the North-South idea is old-fashioned and finished because there's a lot of differences within the South. And of course, it's clear from what I said that I think it's one world approach that we should take. But I don't think we should throw out North-South. That's been very clear from our three panelists, that there's this sort of fundamental unfairness in patents, a fundamental problem about the age shift, a fundamental problem about capacity to negotiate who's got the power, that continues between North and South. It may have become more complex, but it continues. And there's a real danger if we say that no longer exists, that it's often a good way of saying, we've all consensus, so to speak, people say, when there's real divisions and they don't want anyone to point. And so I don't think we should say it's all finished, this North-South thing. I don't think it's finished at all. I think there's a lot of power